if you're trying to build collaboration or solve problems or build relationships, and you start getting defensive, it's like throwing blood in water to a shark and just creates a feeding frenzy.
That's Jim Tamm talking about the importance of gaining control over our own defensiveness to foster collaboration. Jim is a former judge and an expert in building collaborative workplace environments with 40 years of experience in the field of alliance building and conflict resolution. As a senior administrative law judge for the state of California for 25 years, Jim mediated more than 1,000 employment disputes. He's also the author of Radical Collaboration, which was on Amazon's top seller list for workplace, organizational psychology, collaboration, and negotiations books for most of the past 9 years. I'm your host, Warren Hoffman, and in this episode of Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, we'll dig into Jim's process to create collaborative mindsets. We discuss the super chicken model, the 5 skills needed to achieve collaboration, the power of paying attention to your attitude, the importance of Will Schutz's research on openness and creating psychological safety, the 3 biggest fears that can lead to defensiveness, why conflict avoidance is the dominant workplace culture, the common behaviors and characteristics of red zone cultures, the importance for mediators to set boundaries, and much more.
This is Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, podcast of the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for coming on.
Good to be here, Warren.
I've provided a short description of your professional background in the notes and the intro, but can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. For most of my career, I was one of the senior administrative law judges with the state of California dealing with collective bargaining disputes, primarily in the public sector. And then I did that for 25 years, retired from the state about 20 years ago now. Now I teach in a number of programs in the International Management Program at the Stockholm School of Economics, the Leadership Academy at the University of California. For a while, I taught at Santa Clara Law School, taught in Harvard's Talent Development Program and some other MBA programs internationally, executive MBA programs internationally in France, Germany, Mexico, Peru, Panama. When I'm not teaching, I'm also teaching other consultants how to teach collaboration skills, and then occasionally do a few open workshops about collaboration, mostly spend time teaching in fairly high-end leadership programs in large global organizations.
Okay. We'll get into the collaboration skills shortly. I just want to spend a little bit of time, though, on your role as a mediator.
Sure.
And what was your focus? Was it employment disputes? Or?
It was all employment disputes. I had a few, weird ones over a racehorse and a few things like that, but they were almost all employment disputes. And this was over a period of 25 years. I think I've mediated more school district labor strikes than anybody else in the United States.
Wow.
So I have a fair amount of experience working with organizations that are struggling a bit and trying to become more collaborative, or we're struggling and just like to fight too. There's plenty of those around.
Mm-hmm. I won't get into the racehorse dispute, although that sounds interesting. But what about the strikes then? Did you find any or recognize any common themes across these disputes, either with the genesis of the dispute, their positions, the interests? Did anything stand out there if you got so much experience with those?
Well, most of them were economic issues. We had more strikes when we were in good times. When we were in bad times, which is most of the time, there weren't nearly as many strikes. And then when things got better, employees would want to catch up and make up for lost time on their salary increases and things like that. Occasionally, there were times where the strike, it had an economic aspect to it, but I think what really drove the parties out on strike or into that situation was the relationships that they had, the the depth of the anger and the mistrust between themselves more than the economic issues.
So they'd come to the table with dollars in mind, and you would
the language that they used was dollars and cents.
Dollars and
The
cents.
emotion was driving the conversation, though.
Sounds very typical of many disputes.
Yeah, I think it's it's what we're seeing in politics today, certainly in the U.S. It's what we're seeing in a lot of the large global markets as well. When they get into trouble, they're talking one language, but they're being driven by the emotions.
Right, the emotions always operating under the surface. And we'll likely get into that more in a bit, because I'd like to talk about your book, Radical Collaboration, which you mentioned to me earlier that you just got back from Mexico, and it's recently been translated into Spanish.
It's also in Swedish, Dutch, Japanese, Chinese. It'll come out in German probably this quarter, and in Brazilian Portuguese probably this quarter as well.
That's incredible. That's incredible. So incredibly successful book. Let's talk about it. I wonder if we could just go into the chicken research. Is that possible? We could start there?
Sure. The chicken research this is a project that was done by a professor in Indiana, Bill Muir, a tremendous guy. And Bill and his team of researchers were looking at the differences between groups of collaborative chickens versus the star performers, which generally were not nearly as collaborative. They were more aggressive animals, and so the star performers tended to beat each other up a lot. So what Bill was doing was seeing if you can breed collaborative instincts into the chickens, and then if so, what would be the impact of that on their egg production. And so basically he separated out all these more aggressive star performers, and then left the other, which I call the red zone chickens, and then left the other groups, the more collaborative groups, the ones without any big star performers, but I call them the green zone groups. And then he compared the egg production of these groups over a period of time, taking the best egg producers in each generation to produce the next generation. And over time, the green zone chickens, the more collaborative groups without any of the star performers, significantly outperformed these more aggressive red zone chickens. And just a huge impact in egg production. So what that leads to is a realization that this more adversarial, conflicted type of an attitude, rather than producing more eggs, or whatever your organization's equivalent is to more eggs, it tends to produce more red zone behavior, more adversarial behavior, more conflict. Mm-hmm. And a more collaborative attitude tends to produce more cooperation, which leads to, higher egg production, or whatever the organization's equivalent is to more eggs and lower mortality. There's over 50% of these star performers were murdered by their colleagues, pecked to death. The mortality rate of the green zone chickens, the more collaborative chickens, was significantly lower. So it shows that green zone attitudes lead to green zone behavior. Red zone attitudes lead to red zone behavior.
Yes, some really interesting research there, and people can Google the super chicken model if they want to learn more about that. Okay, so let's move on to collaboration then. How do you define collaboration?
Well, I would say it's a sort of a supercharged form of cooperation. It isn't just working together. It's going out of your way to try to ensure that your partner's interests are also taken care of. It's not just trying to get by without doing damage to the other side, but it's actively working together to try and help each other benefit.
I like that. A supercharged form of cooperation. That's great. Now, what about conflict? How does conflict fit into collaboration?
Well, conflict is inevitable. I mean, there is no getting around that. Any relationship especially a long-term working relationship. If it doesn't have any conflict in it, the working relationship is probably not as productive as it could be.
Right.
Either that or you're not paying attention, or you're, overly medicated, or just in complete denial about what's going on at work. So there is going to be conflict there. And there's nothing wrong with conflict. It's just how you deal with it. Because conflict can also be fairly a creative process, in trying to reach rich solutions and creative solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't find anything bad about conflict. It's just that it's uncomfortable for most people. Most people are pretty conflict avoidant.
So let's talk about collaboration and your 5 principles of collaboration. And this came out of a large research project that you undertook?
Yeah, this was a project that started when I was a judge in California, where we kept seeing the same employers coming through our system with employment litigation because they had so much conflict. And we keep seeing the same people over and over and over again. And we were trying to figure out why some organizations operating in the same environment, drawing from the same labor pool, were so conflicted and so adversarial, and other organizations were so cooperative and collaborative, and we hardly ever saw them because these more conflicted organizations were costing the state of California a huge amount of money, primarily in lost productivity. So a small group of us in the state got together and got a big grant from the Hewlett Foundation, did a lot of study on what's the difference between these two, and then based on that, put together a program to try to teach the more adversarial organizations how to be better at collaboration. And we were just wildly successful. I mean, we reduced the amount of measurable conflict, things like unfair labor practice charges, requests from mediators or fact finders. Over a 3.5-year period in almost 100 organizations, we reduced that by almost 70%.
Wow.
It saved the state of California so much money that the state legislature created a nonprofit foundation to keep offering it to the public sector. So based on that pilot project, which was just wildly successful, I ended up writing the Radical Collaboration book. We modified the program a bit, added a few things to help improve the relationship in parties and organizations, started offering it internationally, and it just took off from there. So
that's amazing results, and even starting a nonprofit to continue.
It was certainly surprising, pleasantly surprising, I'll tell you that.
Yeah. You still don't see it. We don't see it in Canada. I find implemented much into the workplace. There's still managers that don't have the proper skills. We still see conflict training somewhat neglected. I mean, studies like this. Sorry, what was the year this research was taken?
Well, this originally started out in the late 1980s.
Yeah.
And then I ended up writing the first edition of the book back in 2004. And then the second edition of the book just came out last year.
Do you mind walking through the 5 principles then?
Sure. The first we call collaborative intention, and it's really the mindset. And the 5 skills, they're both a mindset and a skill set. It's a set of attitudes and a set of competencies that you can actually learn in a fairly short period of time. It isn't rocket science. It's it's basic practical skills. But the first one is collaborative intention, and this is the skill here is being able to stay focused on mutual gains in your relationships when you hit one of those speed bumps in the road. When somebody makes a mistake, does something you don't understand. Can you stay with this collaborative green zone mindset, and get curious, or do you go into the red zone and get furious and start yelling and screaming? So that's the first skill, being able to stay focused like that. And if you just pay attention to your attitude on a daily basis, that can make a difference. At the Stockholm School of Economics, in their international management program where I teach, they have to do a class project every year. And several years ago, they took on this red zone, green zone issue. And wherever they were around the world, several times during the day, they had to write down whether they had a red zone attitude or a green zone attitude. adversarial or collaborative. And then they gathered all this data. They didn't have to try and change it or do anything. They just had to write it down and note it. And what they discovered was at the beginning of the project, more often than not, most of the participants were operating in a more adversarial state of mind in the red zone. By the time they got to the end of this project, more often than not, most of them were operating in the green zone, and they were behaving differently, and they were behaving much more effective at collaboration simply because they were paying attention to their attitude. So that's the good start. The next one we call openness, because there's just been a huge amount of research. One of my mentors, a fellow named Will Schutz, did a lot of research in the military, and the most recent powerful research on this was at Google, where what they've discovered is one of the most important things that you can do to create a high-performing team is to have a high level of psychological safety, where people feel free to raise difficult issues and deal with them directly, rather than indirectly or hiding them or being conflict avoidant. So that makes a huge impact if we can get people in organizations to become more open.
Mm-hmm.
The next one we call self-accountability, which is being aware of the choices that people are making. A lot of times people in organizations feel they don't have too much choice. Their boss tells them what to do, they have to do it. And so if we can get people to take a look at what their own mindset, their own belief system is about how much choice they have in life, and anytime they get into a conflict situation, if they can move up the scale a little bit, even just a little bit, on how much choice they have, it can be very empowering for both individuals and for organizations. The fourth skill we call self-awareness, where we focus on how people behave in relationships with other people, particularly around three key behaviors: inclusion, control, and openness, because those three behaviors have a lot to do with compatibility in the workplace. So we try to get people to see what their preferences are and then be flexible, because it isn't our preferences that get us into trouble, it's our rigidity around those preferences. And then the second thing that we focus on, and I think this is the most important thing regarding self-awareness, is helping people deal more effectively with their own defensiveness. Because if you're trying to build collaboration or solve problems or build relationships, and you start getting defensive, it's like throwing blood in water to a shark, and just creates a feeding frenzy. So I think that's probably the single most important thing that people can do in order to help the collaboration process more than anything else, is deal more effectively with their own defensiveness. And then the last skill is negotiating and problem solving, because like I said earlier, there's bound to be some conflict in any long-term relationship. And so it's important that you be able to resolve that conflict in a way that supports the relationship rather than undermines it. Anybody can go into negotiation with a scorched earth attitude, and that's easy to do that. It's not very skillful, but it's easy to do and fall into that pattern. But it typically doesn't help matters. It usually makes things worse. So being able to negotiate the conflict that you are faced with in a way that builds relationships is very important. So it's the combination of all five of these skills that is what makes a radical difference if you can do it.
Okay, those are great. To recap: collaborative intention, openness, self-accountability, self-awareness, and finally negotiation and problem-solving skills. And they're all important, but you believe it's work on defensiveness where the most traction can be gained?
I think so, yeah, because, if you can deal more effectively with your own defensiveness, you just have a huge leg up on success. When people get defensive, our thinking becomes rigid, our IQ drops about 20 points, and we simply become stupid. And not only are we terrible at solving problems, but when we get defensive, we invite everybody else in the room to get defensive. And then you end up with a whole room filled with defensive people who can't solve a problem, in my background, the technical term for that is litigation.
Yeah.
And it's an expensive term too. Most people underestimate the damage that litigation can do to any kind of a relationship.
Yeah, very true. But let's stay on defensiveness a bit more. It's a complex topic. Understanding and hopefully gaining control over personal triggers. Do you have any recommendations here?
What we try, first of all, defensiveness is a human condition. So it's going to happen. It happens to all of us. I've only met, one or two people in my life who had no defenses. They were both hospitalized and institutionalized. This is a human condition. So we don't expect it to eliminate all defensiveness, at least in the short term. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get people to spot their defensiveness. First of all, understand what it is. Yes. Second, spot it at an earlier point in the process before it's too late, before they all do the damage, and then they can take some action. So starting with what defensiveness is helps. See, most people think when we get defensive, somebody has done something to us and we need to defend ourselves from that person. So we're protecting ourselves from that person. But that's not what's going on when we get defensive. Now, there are bad people out in the world that we need to protect ourselves from. And, we're seeing that more and more these days. And if you're going to be good at collaboration, you need to be able to set clear boundaries. But that's not what I'm talking about when we get defensive. When we get defensive, what we're doing is we're not defending ourselves from another person. We are defending ourselves from fears inside of us that we don't want to feel. Mm-hmm. And so we behave in a certain way so we don't have to feel that fear. Three big fears that come up all the time are our fears about our own significance, our competence, and our likability. So let me give you an example. Say if I have some fears about doing this podcast today, maybe I was traveling late last night, I'm jet lagged, say I'm forgetting things, taking things out of order, not being very articulate. Now, that could cause me a lot of discomfort because I hate feeling incompetent. So if I'm doing that, one of the things that I might start doing in order to reduce my own discomfort is I might start blaming you. You're not asking the right questions. You didn't give me enough time, or you should have sent questions ahead of time. And, this is a horrible time of the day to try and do this. And I come up with all these excuses. All right. It might seem like I'm defending myself from you or the situation, but what I'm really doing is I'm behaving in a way that lets me stay unaware of that fear that I have about my own incompetence. If we can get people to, first of all, understand that that's what's going on when you get defensive. And then second, spot when you're getting defensive at an earlier point in the process. Because most of us don't recognize the fears inside of us because this is all unconscious stuff. So we don't recognize it until we've already done damage in our relationship. So if we can start people focusing on what their external behaviors are before they start getting defensive. I'll give you an example. For when I've noticed over the years that when I start getting defensive, I start talking louder, usually start talking faster. My breathing changes. Right. I start breathing faster. Right. So if I'm say in a room and getting some feedback from people, and I notice that I'm talking faster and louder and breathing faster, if I know that those are my signs of defensiveness, those are my early warning signs of defensiveness, and I pay attention to that and I notice myself doing it, the alarm bells can go off in my head, ding, ding, ding. Hey, Jim, pay attention. You're doing that thing again. Right? And I can tell myself, well, all right, I'm getting defensive. All right, now what can I do about it? Well, then I can take some steps, if I have those planned out ahead of time. So the key is to spotting your defensiveness at an earlier point in the process. And in the Radical Collaboration book, we've got a list of about 50 different signs of defensiveness, like a sudden drop in IQ or withdrawal into deadly silence or flooding with information to prove a point. Some of them might be physical, fast heartbeat, sweaty palms. For some people, it's a high charge of energy. For other people, it's exactly the opposite. Maybe you get lethargic and fall asleep, But whatever they are, if you pay attention to those and be on the lookout for them, then they can tip you off earlier. Then what can you do? Well, one thing you have to do is you have to acknowledge to yourself that you're getting defensive, because if you don't notice it, you won't do anything about it. So you have to acknowledge it. Just, as simple as, wow, I'm getting defensive. Then if you know that you're getting defensive, you know when you're getting defensive, then you can start paying attention to things like, what's the story that you're making up in your mind about it? What's the conversation you're having in your own head here, your internal self-talk? Are you going into a meeting saying, wow, this isn't fair. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to look stupid. They're going to fire me. If you have self-talk going into a meeting about that, then what you should try to do is consciously turn it around into something that's less critical. You don't have to try and convince yourself that you're Superman and you can fly, but just make it less toxic. You can also come up with an action plan, some specific action that you can take if you notice your signs. So this is something you have to plan ahead of time. Like if your sign is flooding with information to prove a point, maybe your action plan is to just be quiet for 15 seconds or 20 seconds. If it's a sudden drop in IQ, you just get stupid. Maybe you go hide in the bathroom for 5 minutes and let your brain catch up with the rest of your body. If it's high charge of energy, then maybe you take a few deep breaths or some kind of a mantra to try and calm yourself down. And so if you spot your signs of defensiveness, then you can take that action. And this will help you in the short term. If you're in the middle of a meeting, you're starting to get defensive and you take a few deep breaths, that can be helpful. But if you really want to deal effectively with your defensiveness over time, what you need to do is figure out what the fear is, right, and figure out, where that came from and what you can do about that. And that's how you deal with it in the long term. But just noticing when you get defensive, noticing what your signs are, having an action plan that you can implement, those are great first steps that you can take. And if you pay attention to that over time, it's going to help.
Wow. So yeah, the defensiveness is a protective measure to some fear. And I think that's a great list of to narrow it down when people are trying to unpack what's happening here. That list of three, the significance, competence, and likability. That's a great list to help.
It's a great starting point. There are other ways that we get defensive, but boy, those show up all the time.
Right. And all fear-based.
Mm-hmm.
And what I find great about your suggestions here is that people don't necessarily have to get into the weeds, the introspective journey to discover the root causes of their defensiveness. And many just don't want to go there. So we can get results more at the surface level, just recognizing what it looks like and what it feels like to us in the moment as early as possible, and then mitigate it using a tailored approach which works best for us. And I guess there could be some opportunity to look for it in others too and strategically address it, calling a caucus, giving a breather, or whatever. So some are going to do this work, but many that are interested in self-improvement, yet in a big organization, I imagine many aren't as well. Have you found there's a critical mass of people needed? So some sort of minimum threshold that's needed to shift the overall dynamics to a collaborative spirit? Or
yeah, well, yeah, I think that is true. It's helpful to have a critical mass of people on a team, for example, or in an organization who are skilled at collaboration, and have a cooperative attitude and things like that. And it doesn't take too many people, too many rotten apples to spoil the situation. But if an organization values collaboration, and you make that clear to everybody, and then people are skillful at it, then if you have someone in that organization that is not being collaborative, that is not skillful and not interested in becoming skillful, then one of the things that the other, more collaborative critical mass can do is they can set clear boundaries and say, this behavior is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. And more organizations are willing to do that right now. In fact, we've seen a huge culture change in organizations over the past, I would say 10 to 15 years. When we first started looking at the impact that culture has on organizations, the ends of the spectrums that we saw was the green zone on one end, the collaborative, and the red zone, this more adversarial, conflicted on the other end. But a number of years ago, we started hearing comments from people saying, well, we're obviously in the green zone because we don't fight. If there's a problem, I just keep my mouth shut. I keep my eyes down and my mouth shut. And they were mistaking the absence of outright warfare for effective collaboration. But it isn't. What they were talking about was just a more conflict avoidant, passive aggressive culture.
Right.
And that's become the predominant culture in organizations today. I think there's been a lot of research on that. And one reason for that is organizations are doing a much better job of dealing with this red zone behavior, this more adversarial, conflicted type of behavior. It used to be that if a manager was, a really aggressive red zone kind of person, they'd say, oh, he's a strong manager. He or she is a strong manager, really goes after it. Well, now they see that's really bully behavior. And most employees are not willing to put up with it, and organizations are doing a better job dealing with it. So we don't see that as the predominant culture anymore. But because they've stopped that adversarial, conflicted behavior, that doesn't mean they're better at collaboration. It just means that it's going underground, and people are passive aggressive now. So the workforces oftentimes are still very fear-based. And so we see a lot of ineffective behavior, even though it doesn't look red zone. It looks more collaborative, but it's not.
Can we dig into that a bit more about the symptoms of red zone cultures? I guess so. If you're a manager or if you're an employee, what should you be looking for? Is it going to be obvious to you, or are there subtle markers to be aware of?
Well, sure. Do people listen well, or do they interrupt? Do they bully each other? Or how tolerant are they when people have different beliefs? Is it safe for people to speak up and voice some opposition without worrying about their job? How creative are the employees? In a red zone environment, if you try something new and it fails, guess what's going to happen? Somebody's going to get blamed. In a green zone environment, if you try something new and it fails, the conversation usually has to do with, well, what can we learn from that?
Right.
How can we avoid that in the future? So there are a lot of little markers like that. What's more difficult to spot is this conflict avoidant type of behavior, where people are fearful about speaking up. And I think that's more difficult to deal with because pink zone workforces are fearful. And it takes a long time to overcome that fear, a long time of effective leadership, effective management to overcome that fear. And which is very frustrating for managers to come in. I worked with a number of organizations where they had red zone management for a number of years, which leads to a more pink zone conflict avoidant type of workforce. And then the red zone management gets fired. They bring in a new management team that is very collaborative, very green zone, and they want it to turn around right away. And it doesn't turn around because the employees are sitting there thinking, well, yeah, we got a new manager here, but how long is that manager going to be here? And just when is the shoe going to drop? So if employees are fearful, it takes a long time to build up that trust. So managers need to be patient and consistent and persistent.
Yeah, let's talk about that process then of transforming a culture from a red zone. I mean, you can't just, as you said, you can't just go in and swap out management.
Yeah.
I guess one aspect is obviously training in these tools to promote collaborative. How else can you go about the process?
It's helpful for people to understand the impact that ineffective collaboration or adversarial relationships have on an organization. A lot of times people don't know any better. It's not like we've been taught how to collaborate when we're going through school. And oftentimes the structure of an organization rewards individual behavior rather than collaborative behavior. I've worked with a lot of organizations where they make an announcement one day. Well, all right, from now on, you're going to be working as a team, and oh, by the way, we're still going to pay you your bonus by your individual sales, but we want you to help each other. Well, the structure of the organization needs to change there also. But I think that the key to transforming an organization is really helping people see the damage that the lack of cooperation and collaboration has on the organization, and then giving them the skills. It doesn't take a long time to train people in these skills. I mean, some listening skills, but then you have to reinforce it too, negotiating skills. I think one of the mistakes we made early on was because the organizations had so much conflict. When we tried to road test this, we went out looking for the most screwed up, dysfunctional organizations we could find to see if it was going to have an impact. Well, that was the easiest part of the whole project. And so at least it was a mistake that I made, where I thought if we just teach these folks how to negotiate their way through conflict, that ought to solve their problem. And what we found over the years was that we could teach people the best negotiating process in the world. And if they came to the table with a bad attitude, or they got defensive, or they got triggered when they were at the table, they would screw up any system we could teach them.
Yeah.
So over the years, we've had to almost reverse the amount of time that we spend on collaborative intention and self-awareness and openness, creating that safe environment, self-accountability. We spend more time on that than we do on the negotiating skills, which is almost a reversal, because those are the ones that make a difference. It looks like all the effective problem solving is being done through the negotiations, but it's because people have that green zone attitude, and they listen well, and they're open about what's going on, and they don't get defensive. That's what makes it work.
Yeah, and it's the hardest to transform as well. We've often taken the time in mediations to teach participants negotiation skills, and we'll place a strong emphasis on interest-based approaches, including tools and the mindset to use their power with each other, the collaborative approach. And it goes great. And then returning to negotiations, people start waving around their batanas and using hardball tactics. Not always, but it's not unusual. What advice might you give to someone at the managerial level, so someone with decision-making power who wants to take steps to move out of a red zone?
Look for people that are moving towards you rather than moving away from you. Try and build allies there. First of all, you got to make sure that you're skillful yourself.
Yeah.
When people say, well, how do I deal with somebody in the red zone? The most important thing you can do there is to not get triggered. So that means you have to have your own act together. You have to be able to be pretty good at dealing with red zone people without going into the red zone yourself.
Right.
So if a manager is in that situation, probably the most helpful thing they can do is to get their own act together and focus on their own defensiveness still. So when somebody else comes at them with a red zone attitude, they don't get triggered and they don't respond in a red zone way. So, that's probably the most important thing that a manager could do. And then, with your own team, you can start educating your team, working with people that you think will be successful at this, give them the skills, let it sort of, move out into the organization. It's going to start within individuals.
Yeah.
It has to start within individuals. You can't just go in and say, all right, now this team is going to be collaborative. You have to find individuals that can do that are skillful. You train them, you have them work together, you make sure that you publicize the successes that they have so you can show the impact within an organization. And then it can start spreading out through the organization, but it has to start with the individuals.
Yeah. So is that what you mean when you meant find people moving towards you for allies and whatnot? You're looking to build a critical mass here of like-minded people. And
exactly. Are there other managers that that are, that feel the same way that you do. Then maybe you can team up. You can work together on projects. Maybe you can, help publicize each other's successes. Maybe you can do joint training together. Yeah.
So that's a top-down sort of movement. What about the other direction though? If you're an employee and you find yourself stuck, so to speak, in a red zone, and you're unable to voice your opinion or raise concerns, maybe there's bullying, intimidation, whatever reason they can't get that help internally.
Yeah.
Any suggestions for someone in that situation?
Well, I would give them the same advice. Deal with your own stuff first, so you don't get triggered by it, so you don't take it personally.
Yeah.
But at some point in time, either at the managerial level or as an employee, if you're bound in that situation and you can't do anything about it, I encourage people, get out.
Yeah.
Go look for another job. Life is too short to be beaten up all the time. Now, a lot of people won't have that luxury. And then, you protect yourself as best you can.
Let's move on to the practitioner then. Mediators or organizational consultants, even team leaders. You've given a lot of practical tips already, but any tips for them working with the group? Any general tips at all here? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me start with what you shouldn't do. If you're dealing with a red zone group or a pink zone group, or just an individual too, the least helpful thing you can do is point out to that person that they're getting defensive, or that they're they're not very effective, or that they're red zone, or whatever the issue that you see. That's just going to make things worse. That's like pouring gasoline on a fire. So don't do that. The second thing, and this is universal advice, is don't get triggered yourself. Stay in the green zone. And I would say I've worked with a lot of mediators. I've done a lot of training of other mediators at various mediation centers and things like that. Taught other judges how to mediate. And I would say probably one of the biggest downfalls that I've seen when mediators get into trouble themselves, it's because they get defensive.
Right.
So if a mediator gets defensive, gets triggered by something that somebody's doing, they're going to lose all their credibility. And if a mediator is going to be effective, people need to trust them. They need to be able to feel that the mediator is paying attention, is not out to get them, isn't angry with them. If the mediator can't do that, you're in the wrong profession, I think.
Yeah.
So that's if the mediator can practice their own skills, then of course they need to know how to negotiate. They need to know how to deal with the underlying interests of the parties. I mean, it used to be the only thing that we'd look at were what are the rights of the parties, at least in labor negotiations. What are the rights and what is the power? Who has the power? Who has the rights? And then over the years, that's been changed, where people were focusing on, well, what are the underlying interests of all the parties? And really what it takes is, it takes a balance of all three, because they interplay all the time. Some people have more rights, some people have more power. And if you can focus organizations and people on trying to understand what their underlying interests are and what the underlying interests of the other party are, and focus your attention on that more, anyway, you have a much greater chance of finding a solution that's going to be helpful to the situation rather than harmful to the situation.
Yeah, the mediator needs to be that pillar.
Yeah,
of reason.
Has to be skillful about that.
Yeah, at times and there's a lot of self-work needed there, because they're going to be the times the scapegoat and the lightning rod, for the emotions to come through. So it can be quite a challenge there. But you mentioned at the start to not point it out, the defensiveness, and that can escalate things, if you will.
Yeah.
But should the mediator not at times address that behavior, set boundaries, similar to when you said that organizations are more commonly doing that? And what's some language they can use to carefully do so?
Well, I mean, I think that the mediator, they're very much in their rights to require a certain level of decorum, a certain level of respect among the parties. You know, sometimes you may need to let people vent a little bit, but if I were working with parties and they needed to vent, I would try to meet with them separately and let them vent to me rather than vent on the other party. So I think it is possible to set a level of respect when you're meeting with the other party, though, and say, look, we're not going to scream at each other. You know, we're not going to throw things. We're going to behave in a civilized way. We're going to treat each other with respect. We're going to listen. And if you're interrupting, I'm going to stop you. You can set those boundaries without being a jerk about it.
Right.
You know, as long as you don't get triggered, you can be very firm about what's okay and what's not okay. But you still listen. You still pay attention. You know, you don't raise your voice unless it's for a strategic reason. You know, I've had times when I don't want to say lost it, because I didn't lose it, but it was a sort of an artificial drama that I would create in order to make a point sometimes. But that's different than being actually triggered yourself, and that's not a helpful thing if the mediator gets triggered.
Right.
If they don't have their own act together, they're going to make things worse typically.
Can you talk more about the strategic sort of feigned anger you just mentioned there, or to make a point?
Yeah,
I'm curious about that.
I had once where I got locked in a room. One of the parties didn't know I was in that room. Well, I was meeting with management, and so they were doing a protest, the union, and I wanted to make a point that you do not lock the mediator in a room. And so I I kicked the door open and, said, don't you ever do that again, and unfortunately for me, I looked up and there was the television camera right there capturing the whole thing. I sort of sheepishly looked over and said, I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't use that. And they didn't. So I they earned my respect and got my cooperation on a number of other situations as a result of that. But that was that was me being dramatic for the point of for the sake of making a dramatic point. Not that it was and that was making a dramatic point to a couple of people who were in leadership roles there, and that never occurred again. I think they got the point very clearly.
That's setting some boundaries there for sure.
Yeah, and the normal boundary setting of, hey, don't do this, wouldn't have worked in that situation. I had the sense that it needed to be something dramatic and explosive, but it was a very calculated situation. So
a calculated kick as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Channel that. Something all mediators need perhaps training in.
Well, hopefully you won't get locked in a room very often.
Yeah, quite important for mediators to set those boundaries when they're operating in these sort of red zones, to set those personal boundaries. And
yeah, I mean, if you don't take a stand sometimes and show that you're in charge of the mediation process, you're not going to be very effective.
Any just last thoughts or on anything at all, general tips to give away? Or I guess people can buy the book, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just out in the second edition. It's the title is Radical Collaboration: 5 Essential Skills to Overcome Defensiveness and Build Successful Relationships. They could take a look at, I've done a TED Talk on this, also on the defensiveness piece. You can just go to YouTube and Google Jim Tamm TED Talk or Jim Tamm defensiveness and see the TED Talk. There's a few other videos out there, I think, that floating around out there of speeches I've given. But yeah, I think you need to become skillful. You need to become self-aware. You have to know the process, and you have to be able to manage yourself. And those are, two very key aspects.
Okay, well, thanks so much for sharing your insights and strategies to foster collaboration. I've really enjoyed talking with you about it, so thanks again, Jim.
I've appreciated it and enjoyed it very much. Thanks, Warren.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more from international experts digging into a range of topics on conflict, power, and persuasion, subscribe to your favorite podcast app or visit us at cien.org. That's CIIAN.org.